Good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network's BRN Sunday podcast, where members of academia, financial services, and the media analyze all the news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more. I'm Jeff Snyder, your host. We've got another great show, but first, hope you had a wonderful Valentine's Day with you and yours. So let's jump right in, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. Well, let's kick things off, as we always do, with a look at the latest social media trends. And joining me on the line from San Francisco, California, he's the Senior Financial Services Editor for LinkedIn, Mr. Devin Banerjee. Hey, Devin, how are you?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I should say you must be depressed having come home from the Cayman Islands, and now you're just back home in San Francisco. I mean, you have such a tough life, Devin.
It was a really nice trip last week to Grand Cayman, and yep, I'm back in pretty chilly, pretty foggy San Francisco, unfortunately.
Yeah, but some really good news out of the Cayman Islands when it comes to the ESG. That was a really good story. So let's look back at the week that was. What were some of the top stories that you and the team at LinkedIn covered?
Yeah, some really thought-provoking conversations and stories this week that we featured. The first one I'm going to touch on, kind of newsy. This was on Thursday. Wells Fargo came out and said it would be the first big bank to drop what's called mandatory arbitration in sexual harassment cases. So mandatory arbitration, for those who don't know, is this kind of legally binding resolution process that takes place outside the court system. Almost always is accompanied by non-disclosure agreements, and it's really been criticized for driving a lot of harassment cases under the rug and outside of the public eye. And it's one of the reasons a lot of people point to for not seeing a lot of big Me Too cases in financial services, which I would venture to say, and many people would venture to say, is not very dissimilar from other industries when it comes to harassment, probably. So big move by Wells Fargo. Mandatory arbitration has already kind of been ditched by a lot of companies in other industries, especially in big tech. But as I said, in banking and financial services, this is really a big first step. And as I said, this practice shoves a lot of the cases under the rug, but it also, employees are often found to be at a disadvantage in forced arbitration cases. A study by the Economic Policy Institute found that employees lose about 2/3 as often in mandatory arbitration versus in court. So big move by Wells Fargo. A lot of people are respecting that, and it'll be interesting to see if and when their peers follow suit.
Yeah, it's always good to see Wells Fargo on the other end of financial news reporting. So kudos to them.
That's true.
That's it's good, and I say that with tongue in cheek, but I do mean that. That's a positive step. And look, Devin, we talk about ESG and the importance of that, and this is a step in that direction, right? I mean, this could be something that if you're an investor in Wells Fargo and you're an activist investor, you would probably look at this as a positive, given some of the things that have transpired over the last few years.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And ESG is just a topic that we're going to continue hearing more about. As you and I have talked about, we're really seeing the money flows starting to drive action in ESG, starting to see people holding the purse strings, like the asset allocators, the big, pools of capital, really starting to put pressure there. And actually, one of our stories that did really well this week was featuring a Barron's list of America's top 100 sustainable companies. Now, this did focus a bit more on environmental sustainability, but also did touch on the S&G factors, the social and governance factors. And what was interesting about it is we're starting to see, some of these big name companies that talk about sustainability. Those are the ones that get a lot of the press. But if you think about it, what their actions are doing is starting to drive action among their clients, their suppliers, their vendors, even their competitors. And so at the top of this list that Barron's put together of sustainable companies were businesses like Agilent Technologies, which is a laboratory instrument and software maker. And others like Texas Instruments, Savoya Financial, HP, industrial supplier, W.W. Granger, component distributor, Avnet, software company, Autodesk. So, these aren't the companies that you read about, whose CEOs are out there at conferences and stuff talking about it. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing them really take the lead on these issues, mostly because their big customers are taking the lead on this. And so that's been a really interesting kind of nuance to this whole conversation recently.
Yeah, I'm wondering, the thing that I want to explore on a future episode of either the podcast or the network is what goes into evaluating these different ESG factors and how do you monitor that? I'm not clear. Like I said, I support the endeavor completely. I'm just not clear how you benchmark. And so I've been reaching out to folks and trying to learn a little bit more because I think that's important. I mean, how do you hold someone to the standard? And what is the standard? And is the standard the same, Devin, across sectors, across industries, across organization types, right? I mean, I think that's a fair question to ask. So as we're growing this sustainable investing, asset class or approach, obviously, I come from a consulting background, so investment consulting background. So of course, I'm going to be interested in that.
I think that's really where the conversation will head from here, is the data quality and the data standardization, so that all of these things can be ranked and assessed comparatively. Because when you're either an investor or some other decision maker, and you're looking at a list of 100 or 1,000 companies in a screen, you need to be able to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So, what's been great to see so far is some of the big, data providers, Bloomberg, Refinitiv, which used to be Thomson Reuters, MSCI, et cetera, coming out with metrics, but again, they're all coming out with different flavors of it. And so it'll be interesting to see if and when and how it's all standardized.
Yeah, I think I agree, and this is not an easy. It's hard to standardize things. This is not like a cookie cutter approach, right? Because industries are different, and it's like investment policy statements in a retirement plan or an endowment or foundation, right? I mean, there's all different. There's philosophies and way to do it, and maybe that's a direction you have to go. Maybe it's embedded in the IPS. I don't know, but it seems very interesting to me. I want to learn more about it, and hopefully we can find some good guests who will be able to educate both myself and the audience.
Yeah, definitely. One more story I'll point out because it really, really took off, and it's something that I think is really important. There is still a lot of talk and action and talent flowing into the crypto space, and there are definitely valid use cases of it and valid, really exciting potential use cases of it. But we did feature a story that the Journal really did a great job reporting on last week about crypto scams. The Journal looked back at 2019 and found that it was actually a really big year for scams in crypto, taking in about $4 billion from people. So this was based on an analysis by a company called Chain Analysis, which found that Ponzi schemes and scams involving Bitcoin and other forms of crypto brought in, as I said, just over $4 billion from kind of innocent people and investors in 2019. Really interesting story to read. I would just encourage you to take a look. The Journal kind of excerpted a lot of conversations between, as I said, innocent investors and scammers that look very legit. And, I think anecdotally, you start seeing more of these on the internet or in your inbox, and you get scammed with this stuff. And I think, it's obviously doing a disservice to the valid potential of cryptocurrencies going forward, but also kind of a very important reminder that this space is still very new and very amorphous, very fluid, and also unregulated largely.
Yeah,
so I thought it was a very important story.
Yeah, that is important, and I would just broaden it a little bit. Well, first of all, when you look at the crypto space, it's $300 billion in total. So what you just described as $4 billion in cryptocurrency scams, that's a little over 1%. That's significant. Yeah. I mean, that's a significant aspect of that. Secondly, I would just broaden the topic a little bit to say, we covered it on the network this week. twice. One, tax scams. There are apparently a lot of tax scams now that can impact people. People filing taxes like fraudulently, not the actual holder of the account, but someone else stealing the account and filing and getting a refund fraudulently. So that's a big deal.
Yeah. Wow.
And the SEC, we had Kevin Urso on, who's a he's a cybersecurity expert, discussing the SEC best practices when it comes to cybersecurity. This is a huge issue. It's not just a crypto issue, even though we were talking about cryptocurrency. This is a big issue across multiple industries.
Yeah, and I do know it's top of mind for professionals in the industry, like some of our friends you just mentioned, and Kevin Kelly and some other mutual friends of ours. And I know it's top of mind for them, and they're trying to pursue, valid paths and use cases, and many of them generally are pro-regulation and pro-policies. But it's just one of those stories that I really want kind of the everyday investor who reads about this stuff and hears about this stuff on TV to just read and be reminded of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, people need to be on guard whether you're investing in crypto or doing something else. So hopefully, just got to be vigilant. Well, Devin, always a pleasure talking with you. You guys do great work. And I should also point out, check out Devin Banerjee's This Week in Finance put together by he and his team. Amazing work bringing together all the hot discussion topics on the LinkedIn platform, 650 million strong. Devin, always a pleasure talking with you. I don't know how you do it, but we appreciate you coming on the program and the network on a regular basis. Enjoy President's Day and Valentine's Day, of course.
Yeah, you too, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Thanks, bud. Take care. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk a little technology, and joining me on the line, Senior Technology and Consumer Products Reporter with The Motley Fool, Mr. Dan Klein. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. You stay local this week?
I'm in just back from Texas, in West Palm for a few days, off to Alexandria, Virginia, Fool headquarters, and then Orlando, Florida for a little fun next weekend.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. Well, always great talking with you. I want to catch up with you. There's a lot going on in the tech world. But let's talk about streaming services, especially Roku. What can you tell us about the growth of subscribers there?
Yeah, so Roku is kind of the Switzerland of streaming services. Because if you look at any of the other devices, if you buy Apple TV you assume is biased towards Apple products. So the same thing with if you buy a Google streaming device. So Roku is in this unique position that it's a streaming platform that does not also own content. So as a consumer, unless you have a predilection towards one of the other services, I mean, if you really love Apple, it probably makes sense to get Apple TV. But Roku is kind of very neutral on this, and that makes it sort of a really easy platform to do business with. They can sort of work with everybody, and that's been a big benefit to them. And I've been a little skeptical on Roku as an investment. I still think they're going to be bought out by someone larger, which is, of course, usually good if you're an investor. But at the moment, they're a very neutral player, and that allows them to be embedded in all sorts of televisions. They're up to 36 million people using the platform. So it's a very strong piece of technology that I think is sitting out there for the taking.
And just for, I guess, for full transparency, our family is a Roku user, and this has no bearing on whether or not we cover the story or not. We're covering everything, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Dan, what's the model here? I mean, how does a Roku make money? Because I pay for the Roku box. But and maybe occasionally the content, but how do they make money as the Switzerland, or I would call them the Morning Pulse, the BRN of the streaming service?
So they probably don't make money selling devices. I have a hard time believing that when you buy a $29 Roku stick, there's a lot of profit in that. Where they make money is if you get a Roku and you haven't signed up for a service. So let's say you're on Roku and you're like, hey, I want to get Major League Baseball. I think it's called Extra Innings, where you can get all the games or whatever. It doesn't matter what the services cost, but when you get this service and you pay for it through Roku, Roku gets a cut of that.
Got it.
If you sign up for Netflix for the first time through Roku, they get a cut of that. So it's monthly recurring revenue. If you rent a movie on Roku, they probably get a pretty big piece of that. So there's all sorts of little different ways they make money. And the good thing for them is it's recurring. The bad thing for them is I use a Roku. I also have some Amazon Fire Sticks. I probably have an Apple TV somewhere. I definitely have a Google device somewhere. So I have pretty much everything. But I subscribe to most of my services through my phone before I got any of these. So Roku's not making much money on me. On the other hand, if I am using the Roku TV and my wife wants to watch a movie, well, there's a few dollars for Roku, and there's no cost of transaction for that. They don't have to do anything for it. So their goal as a company is building out that platform, getting as many people to have the device and getting as much content as possible. And they might be the people that solve a problem we always talk about, is that it's very difficult to switch through services. I know my Roku remote control has a button for Netflix, a button for Sling, a button for Hulu, and I forget what the fourth one is, but I know the fourth one is defunct, so now it goes to something that isn't what's on the picture on it. And that helps, but there's still a transition period, a period made worse because my internet at that particular home is not so great. And I do think someday Roku will figure out how to sort of integrate all this technology, all these different channels, all these subscriptions you have, so you could say, hey, Roku, just show me all the James Bond movies I can watch. Show me all the comedies. Show me all the cooking shows. And it will give you that sort of platform agnostic. We're not there yet, but Roku could be the people that figure this out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum probably for the audiences, from the audience perspective. But I mean, this is the model that we've chosen for the Broadcast Retirement Network and for the Morning Pulse. I mean, we want to be, I don't know, all things to all people, but we want to be able to give people an unbiased look at information. This seems to be what consumers really want, Dan. And I got to think this is direction. I want to get your perspective on this. I think this is direction for future services.
Yeah, I think consumers want to be able to buy what they want easily and access it easily. So if you look at what's working in retail, it's a model called omnichannel. And omnichannel means I could be standing in a Best Buy looking at the TV I want, realize I don't want to deal with schlepping it around, and order it online for delivery to my house the next day or 2 days maybe in the case of Best Buy. Or I could be sitting at home and say, you know what, I don't want to wait for delivery. I'm going to order it now. I'm going to drive to Walmart. They're going to bring it to me at the curb, and I'm not even going to have to go inside. Or some things I'm going to walk inside and go to a kiosk, and I'm not going to have to talk to a person. So that's what's going to happen in the digital space, that just like it's become with music, where you can access your whatever subscription service you have on pretty much any device wherever you are, when you subscribe to Netflix or Disney Plus or Hulu or whatever it is, they're going to find more convenient ways to deliver you that content. Because right now, the chief advantage of television is if I'm watching, say, I don't know, a hockey game I don't care that much about, and I don't know, maybe I'm sort of also watching Chopped on the Food Network, I can flip between the two of those very easily. Can't do that in the streaming world, so that's a big hurdle to fix, and Roku could very well be the leader in fixing it.
All right, Dan, I want to shift gears. Let's talk about a recent telecom wireless merger I know you wanted to talk about, because I think a lot of people out there may be subscribers or maybe using these wireless services. What do they need to know?
Yeah, so the final hurdle has been cleared for T-Mobile to acquire Sprint. People use the word merger, but this is the company is going to be called T-Mobile, and it really is T-Mobile taking over Sprint. And in a lot of cases, this would be bad for consumers. You know, we're going from 4 major wireless carriers to 3, which set off some red flags, and that's why there was a lot of federal regulatory concern. But in this case, the entire T-Mobile business model is staked on fair, low pricing and transparency. And with the small caveat that I did not love their Super Bowl commercial, which talked about a 5G network that doesn't really exist yet, that was a little bit out of character and bothered me. But for the most part, T-Mobile doesn't charge extra fees. The taxes you pay are part of the price they quote you. So they don't tell you it's $45 a line a month and then it becomes $75 because there's all sorts of extra fees. They're very transparent. And what's going to happen is adding these subscribers from Sprint, and it'll take years to figure out if they're going to keep the Sprint name, if they're not the same technology, so they're going to have to migrate them to a different technology. But this gives them about the size of their two competitors, AT&T and Verizon. And that's going to allow them to more efficiently invest in 5G. And 5G is next generation internet that will theoretically give you home-like experiences when you're watching video. So it'll be internet speeds that we're only used to at home or in the office on your phone. So that's a major game changer when it comes to, do I have a TV at all? Younger people might say my phone's my device, or my phone plus my iPad are my device. And T-Mobile has forced AT&T and Verizon to do a lot of things that are good for consumers. Get rid of contracts, get rid of overages, things that have really benefited you. So as much as this is an industry shrinking, I still think it's a very strong positive for consumers.
Yeah, competition obviously taking hold here, and that's the nature of a capitalist system. Dan, what's it mean in terms of, if I have Verizon today, which I do, and I want to explore possibly T-Mobile, Sprint, whatever it's called, T-Mobile, what's it mean in terms of network? I mean, how do I live in the New York City area, you live in the Palm Beach, West Palm area. How do you assess whether or not to make that move? Because cost shouldn't just be a factor.
So I think it's somewhat personal at this point. So I was a Sprint customer who became a T-Mobile customer. Sprint runs commercials now saying, hey, all networks are good. We might have the worst network, but it's only 2% worse than everybody else. And to a point, that's true, but it's very personal. So for me, I have T-Mobile. And T-Mobile works incredibly well almost everywhere I go, except my family home in New Hampshire and I haven't been there in quite a while, so maybe this is no longer true, but the home was an absolute dead spot. Now that didn't matter on T-Mobile because T-Mobile lets you use Wi-Fi calling. So we have internet there. Once I'm in the house, I can hook up in the internet. But if we didn't have that, or if I had Sprint, which I don't think they allow Wi-Fi calling in the same fashion, I might have to change services. So it doesn't matter who has the best network if that network has a weak spot where you happen to be or where you happen to live. And all networks are stronger some places versus others. So what makes sense to do is talk to people that live literally on your block, or in my case, in my building, and find out what they have and how well it works. Because you wouldn't want to save, $40 a month switching to T-Mobile to find that your neighborhood in New York isn't well served by T-Mobile. And it can be that personal. As someone who travels a lot, I've never had an issue with T-Mobile. Maybe if I traveled to a city that was weak regularly, I would think differently. So you really need to research it and talk to people who sort of have the lifestyle you do and go to the places you go to.
Last question, Dan. What about if you bundle? So I use Verizon for wireless. My wife and I use Verizon for wireless, and we also use Verizon Fios. That's got to be a consideration too, right? Because you lose those bundle benefits.
Yeah, it's a $5 to $15 a month benefit, so you have to factor that in.
Yeah.
And the reality is, when you look at Comcast, Verizon, companies that sell multiple products, in the case of Comcast, cable plus internet, when you drop cable, they find a way to make their revenue up in internet. So you do have to be careful about that. And 5G may change that. It may give people the alternative to say, I don't need an internet service provider at home. That's probably not going to be the case for, not super young guys like us who are used to watching television on a television. We probably won't switch to watching television solely on tiny little devices. But yeah, you have to look at the total cost. And you also have to look at things like, well, what's the deal on the phone? In most cases, it's really a question of how you finance a phone or whether you buy it up front. On the other hand, there are sometimes deals where if you own your phone and trade it in, they're giving you a very good price or free on, a good price on, say, the latest iPhone, free on maybe an off-model Android phone. So you have to factor in the entirety of the purchase. In my case, I like to trade my phone in every year, and T-Mobile makes that very easy. If you haven't paid X percentage of it off, you have to pay to that point, and then you can just trade it in and make the new payments. It's sort of a very simple process. I've had a more difficult time when I was with Sprint. Now, again, that may have changed. It's been a few years. So as a consumer, you really need to look at the total package, and you also need to look for specials because it's very easy to move now. So for a while, Sprint was offering an absolutely incredible deal if you brought your own phone that one of my colleagues got, pennies on the dollar phone service for not that long, for let's say 6 months. And at other times, T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T might have a very good deal for a family of four. The problem is I don't have a family of four. I have a family of three, and a fourth line is not all that valuable to me. So you really need to do your homework and figure out, a little bit of guessing. Is the best promotion now going to be the best promotion 6 months from now? And if it isn't, am I willing to switch? And what is that going to cost me? So this is one of those areas where I suggest to people, make the best deal you can and then stop looking at prices.
Yeah.
Because after you buy a mattress, it doesn't help you to see that mattresses went on sale 6 months later.
Yeah, good point. And you need to be an active consumer. Dan, always a pleasure talking with you. And I know we're going to see you on Tuesday on the network. So looking forward to that as well.
I'll see you in the future.
See you, bud. Bye. Welcome back. We're going to talk a little markets now. Joining me on the line, co-founder of Delphi Digital, a cryptocurrency research firm, Kevin Kelly. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Doing great, Jeff.
Yeah, it's good to talk with you. Not much going on in the market, so I don't know what we're going to talk about today. Yeah, look,
there's always something going on in the market.
Yeah, I can tell, and I know there's a little bit of we're talking Friday afternoon, 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, and a little bit of a sell-off going on, and it looks like, Kevin, coronavirus rears its ugly head again. And, I hate getting into this. Before you begin, and I'll let you talk a lot during this next 15 minutes or 14 minutes, but what I got to tell you is I hate when the news cycle gets caught up with one particular issue, and it seems to drive the market. So what say you? What's going on in the markets? What can you tell the audience?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think certainly I'm with you to that point, but I do think that the severity of the coronavirus, and obviously you've had a lot of, I would say a bit more confusion this week in terms of what the actual potential reach of it is at this point, right, with revised numbers coming out. And obviously there's always been a bit of skepticism, I guess you'd say, about the actual numbers that are being reported in general. But no, I definitely think it's something that's certainly affecting markets, and it's something that's obviously generating, most of the headlines at this point, because I think what a lot of market participants are looking for is not necessarily an excuse, but a potential headwind for a market that, and when I say a market, I mean across different asset classes and financial markets, not just equities, but I mean, if you looked at bonds and even gold, a few couple commodities that have done well recently, especially some of the precious metals. I think a lot of people were just kind of looking for what the next potential headwind would be that could threaten kind of that everything rally, because a lot of asset classes were starting to be not only just kind of overvalued or overpriced, but certainly kind of price for perfection, especially if you look at equities. And so when you look at something like coronavirus, the uncertainty we've talked about countless times, markets hate uncertainty. And so, the sell-off, today, if you look actually, expanding the timeline a little bit, markets are actually holding up, incredibly well for the potential damage of something like coronavirus, and the uncertainty that surrounds it, especially when you look at, the global supply chains, you look at economist revisions for Chinese GDP, depending on how long, certain key parts of the country remain idle, things of that nature. I mean, it certainly could have some temporary effects, but, certainly still sit in the camp. But I think it will be transitory longer term, because, again, it's not something that's necessarily going to hurt long-term demand. If anything, you're just going to have a bit of pent-up demand in the short term. So I think there's reasons why the market and financial media is really gravitating towards coronavirus or latching onto it, because right now, I mean, there's a lot of potential headwinds that are out there, but they're not quite as obvious or as extreme or flashy, I guess you could say, as something like this.
Yeah, and from what I've been reading, and want your interpretation on this, but it looks like the Wall Street Journal survey indicates, and I guess it's a survey of economists, and you know what the old rule is: if you put 12 economists in a room, you get 13 different opinions. But coronavirus likely to hit first quarter U.S. growth, so it's going to hit GDP, and I think that makes sense. But at the same time, we've got some good, realistic job numbers, really good job numbers, I think, and some other economic data. Is this a case, Kevin, that we keep on trying to talk ourselves into. It's like the bulls and the bears arguing, and the bears are like trying to come up with some thing that kind of caused this us to kind of go downwards. I don't know. Just
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, bulls can certainly argue that, again, probably that argument that I just made in terms of having more kind of transitory effects. And you're certainly seeing it show up. I mean, if you look at just kind of like global air travel, especially around, the Chinese Lunar New Year and things like that, like it can show up in the data itself, like the actual hard numbers in the data. But I think longer term, it's going to be a bit more transitory. But if you're a bear, or, there's countless reasons right now why you can make the argument that a lot of asset classes are pretty overvalued, especially as you start to get this fiscal policy machine that not only we're calling for here in the U.S. From our Fed chair Jerome Powell, who's called out fiscal policy, but you're also seeing more pressure from European Central Bank head Christine Lagarde calling for more fiscal stimulus. I think this whole kind of move towards looser monetary policy and fiscal policy that's going to kind of continue to fuel this debt bubble is something longer term that is much more concerning than something like coronaviruses in the short term. Again, I'm no medical expert, and I could be completely off in my assessment of it in terms of what its longer term effects could be. But that's just what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from people I'm keeping in touch with.
Yeah, let's before we go to cryptocurrency, a lot going on there. I just want to talk about sustainable investing. I know obviously as a former equity strategist and analyst, this is something that's been for Bloomberg has been top of mind for you. What can anything you want to say here in terms of sustainable investing? This is a big topic. This is not a short-term trend. This is something that has really picked up, and I'd say in the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's certainly going to be a secular trend. It's not something that's transitory, especially when you think about how younger generations are really kind of having this start to be at the forefront of their investment decisions. And you think about the amount of wealth, the kind of generational wealth transfer that's going to happen over the next, let's call it, 15, 20 years. Certainly think that things like ESG and some of those buzzwords that you hear or acronyms that you hear is not a trend that's going away. I think what's going to be interesting is seeing how the standards and structure around investing and getting some type of standardized way in which you can evaluate these companies from a sustainability perspective is going to be really interesting, especially when you look at the BlackRock and the Vanguards of the world and the whole movement towards passive index funds, ETFs, passive investing in general. If they can craft a great ESG type investment product that a younger generation or a millennial could put some of their funds into directly and have a more kind of hands-off approach. I think that's definitely one of the trends that I'd be watching for as this kind of passive investing trend continues.
Yeah, and just so I cannot be accused of leading the witness, you brought this up. How do you evaluate? Because your definition of sustainability could be a little bit different than mine, or ESG could be a little bit different than mine. And I think that the question in my mind is, this is a trend. I think we all fundamentally agree, and we believe in obviously protecting and doing things that are in the best interest of everyone. But how do you evaluate these? And I think that's the concern that I have, and I'm trying to figure out. So when I talk to people,
yeah, and I don't think there's necessarily going to be one, at least in the foreseeable future, one kind of way in which you can do that, right? Or one standard where you have, let's say, 12 boxes that you check off and say if a company's sustainable or not. I think it's going to depend on the industry, and it's not going to be binary and one or none. I think you'll see, for example, if you look at, like the oil industry and fossil fuels, you could almost make the argument that maybe even a company that is starting to pare back on its environmental effects, and it's not necessarily sustainable or improving the environment in which it operates, but it's at least taking measures to kind of curb back those negative or adverse effects. Maybe that is something where that fits into a lower tiered kind of sustainability ETF or something of that nature, because you're looking at kind of incremental improvement instead of going the pure kind of green, environmentally friendly route. And again, that could be I'm no sustainability expert either. I'm right there with you. I don't know how exactly these standards are going to transpire, but I do think that it's going to be something where there's going to be kind of a wide spectrum depending on what the industry is, what the actual standards are, and what people actually start to look for and how they define sustainability. And then the investment products most likely will, emerge around those various different pockets of sustainability investing.
Yeah, excellent analysis there, Kevin. So let's talk. We've got about 4.5 minutes left. Let's talk crypto. And from what I've read, cryptocurrency market is now valued at over 300 billion. I hope Delphi Digital has 299 of that. I'm sure
Well,
you're
if I
hoping
was,
that.
I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere probably, not pumping out research still. But no, I mean, it is the crypto markets have had over 100 billion in market value, in 2020 so far. Which again, I mean, if you put it in relative perspective, that's basically the amount of cash that's sitting on Apple's balance sheet, right? So it's still a very very small market relative to other asset classes. But you are seeing kind of an interesting trend. I think right now the market's getting a bit over its skis, at least in the short term. I think if you bucket the crypto market and crypto assets into a couple of different categories, I mean, you've got Bitcoin that I think actually is in a pretty sustainable uptrend right now. Again, you can see some pullbacks in the near term, but I think breaching back above 10K, I think has been pretty significant, at least from a psychological level for a lot of people. I think that actually does have some legs to it, but some of these other kind of alternative crypto assets that have doubled or even a handful that have tripled year to date so far, it's a double-edged sword, because there's the people that are invested in that are more kind of your crypto enthusiasts that are playing this kind of alternative crypto asset speculative market, certainly are benefiting. But I think if you take a step back and you look at kind of institutions or more traditional investors, the argument that the crypto markets are becoming more mature is a difficult one to make sometimes when you do see these really kind of parabolic moves still, and then the questions of price manipulation and low liquidity and fragmented liquidity in exchanges comes into play. So it depends on which kind of, I guess, a coin you're sitting on right now. If you're an investor, I mean, certainly benefiting you, and there is arguments for having a bit more of a diversified portfolio for events like this, where you do have periods where alternative crypto assets will outperform something like Bitcoin. But I think by and large, it is good overall just to get some crypto back in the press, back in the headlines. We've had an increase in inquiries about just what's going on in this market and how people can play it. So certainly I think net overall a good thing, but definitely is still very speculative and certainly very risky.
So can you flip a Bitcoin for either heads or tails? Because you just use that. No matter how you flip. So can you?
Yeah, the proverbial which side of the coin. No, that's the funny thing is you actually can't. Just by nature of being digitally native. Maybe one day someone will come up with some interesting visualization where you can do that. But
yeah, cool.
No, it's not like a Chuck E. Cheese coin.
Yeah, and we had talked. You were on the network, I think, a couple of weeks ago, talking about regulation. Looks like the U.S. Treasury is going to roll out some cryptocurrency rules. Thoughts about that? I mean, have you any tea leaves on that, on where it stands? Because the concern was welcoming regulation, but also concerned about hindering innovation, hindering the use of digital currency and other asset classes.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be anything too crazy or too unexpected if you've been keeping kind of pace with crypto regulation, at least at a high level. But I do think, the key concerns are still around kind of tax implications and the government trying to create ways in which people, or I guess close some loopholes in which people are able to kind of evade taxes on some of their crypto gains. That's probably going to be a big focus, going forward, but also again, the kind of educational aspect of, the risk that really sits in some of these. And again, you can have these things pop 100, 200% over a matter of just a couple of weeks. But, that's oftentimes much more kind of paper gains. And if you were trying to move out of that position in size, you would certainly experience a ton of slippage. And just given the liquidity and the fragmented nature of this market, like I mentioned before, a lot of some of that 300 billion that we were talking about earlier in terms of market value, if you try to move out of this space, would certainly be pretty reflexive, I think.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, we covered in 15 minutes, we covered coronavirus, equity markets, fixed income markets, economics, cryptocurrency. Well done, my friend. Really appreciate you coming on the program.
Another Friday for us.
It's just another Friday for you, for Delphi Digital. Kevin Kelly, always a pleasure talking to you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will talk with you very soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, Jeff. Talk soon.
Bye. Welcome back. Now time to shift gears to real estate. And who better to do that for us than Jacob Passy? He is the real estate reporter for Market Watch. Hi, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
I'm doing okay. I know you were incredibly busy. Appreciate you making some time for the show today. Lots going on in the real estate world. What's top of mind for you and the team at MarketWatch this week?
Yeah, so my colleague and I did a story this week based on the news that Jeff Bezos has set a new real estate record in Southern California. He bought the Warner estate from media mogul David Geffen for reportedly $165 million. So we did a story looking at that price and what he pays in taxes, comparing it to property taxes, that is, comparing it to what's going on over at Amazon.
So that's a steal. It sounds like that is a bargain, Jacob. I mean, for someone like him, sure. There's been, when you calculate it out, that house, the sales price is equivalent to less than 1% of his net worth. So certainly not necessarily an expensive outlay for him. And what we found is that what he paid for the house, $165 million, is actually more than what Amazon has paid so far in taxes for 2019. So I know there's been lots of news recent years, lots of discussion among politicians about how Amazon doesn't pay taxes, et cetera. That's not really true. They do pay taxes. They just also, were able to do what a lot of Americans do to, lower their tax bill via, credits for years where they recorded losses and things like that. So the past couple of years, they did actually receive tax credits at the federal level. That was not the case in 2019. In 2019, they paid so far $162 million in taxes, and they've also have deferred tax liability of $914 million. But basically, it's kind of striking, what Amazon has already paid in taxes is still less than what Jeff Bezos just paid for a house. Granted, gigantic house on 9 acres with a tennis court and a nine-hole golf course, but still a house nonetheless. But and this is probably not his only house, right? Is this?
No,
he has a house in Seattle, right? Somewhere around there.
Yeah, he has property in Seattle. He owns multiple apartments in New York, including 3 apartments within the same building. He also owns other property in California, and recently also purchased some undeveloped land in Los Angeles through his kind of venture company basis expeditions, I think is the name of it. So he's got lots of property. Can't say just yet what the income tax picture looks like for him, because we also looked at the property tax rate and how that compares to the effective tax rate that Amazon pays. So in property taxes, on average in Los Angeles County, people pay 1.25% on the assessed value of their home. And so, that in California, there's actually a limit of 1% for property taxes, but then, local at the state level, but then localities can charge a little bit more than that, an extra couple percentage points here and there, or fractions of percentage points here and there for things like school bonds and whatnot. So that's the case in Los Angeles County. So, and that's about, that's actually average. The average nationwide is like around 1.2% in property taxes. So, when people talk about California being a high tax state, what they're really talking about is the income tax. Yeah. At the property tax level, they're actually not. They're actually quite average. And certainly there are lots of states that are much higher than that. But that interestingly, that is the same. No, this is a little bit comparing apples and oranges, but the effective tax rate that Amazon paid once you take into account, all the, loopholes they're able to use and whatnot, their effective tax rate when you divide their total liability by the amount in income, that comes to also 1.2%. So kind of an interesting, kind of puts into perspective, what America, because what the property tax rate that that Jeff Bezos will pay for his his new home in Beverly Hills, is the same rate that folks all across Los Angeles County pay, second largest city in the country. So this isn't the reason it's an apt comparison is it kind of shows what our this, and that's just obviously one piece of what people owe in taxes, but it shows kind of how our individual tax liabilities compare to corporations, and kind of an interesting way at looking at a lot of these dynamics that are obviously discussed a lot on the political stage, especially.
Yeah, he is, and he is a target, just a verbal target. Just to be clear, verbal target of both sides of the spectrum. But I was going to ask you, and I think you kind of alluded to this. What was the takeaway? I mean, what was the reaction? I guess my first question is, what was the reaction to the article that you and your colleague wrote? I'm curious to know what people thought about that.
Well, the article literally just went up a little bit ago, so still haven't. I'll be able to report back next week.
Okay.
It went up today, so not quite sure yet what the reaction will be. I mean, in terms of the reaction to the sale, though, Robert Reich, who is a former labor secretary, kind of tweeted about how he was the labor secretary and served in the Clinton administration and the Ford administration and the Carter administration. He tweeted about the sale and was kind of critical, kind of pointing out that this is just kind of indicative of how the richest man in the world was able to buy, one of the richest homes in the country, or one of the most expensive homes in the country. What was his exact tweet? He said, Jeff Bezos' new $165 million Beverly Hills mansion will have 3 hot houses, 2 guest houses, a 9-hole golf course, a tennis court, a motor court with gas pumps. And then he said, remember when Amazon's Whole Foods cut health benefits for part-time workers to save money? So it kind of puts some of this in comparison. And then he also tweeted, meanwhile, Amazon paid $0 in federal income taxes in 2018. Seems fair, right? So, there was lots of criticism going online, especially when people were pointing it in the context of, net worth. It's, other sites had a kind of a comparison that isn't super accurate, where they were saying, comparing, what this home's value was worth relative to Jeff Bezos's net worth, and they said, that would be somewhat like, a household that earns $60,000 a year buying a home for $75. Now, granted, net worth isn't the same as annual income. So let's say that's the same as someone with a net worth of $60,000, which is, I think, about average for folks between the ages of 35 and 44. Middle age, kind of kind of the age range a lot of millennials and Gen Xers are in right now. Folks in that range, the median net worth, I think, is around $60,000. So someone with that median worth, if they bought a home that was relative to their net worth, similar percentage as Jeff Bezos, would only have to spend $75. And certainly for a lot of Americans, I don't think there's a single American that has managed to buy a home for that much. I mean, as you and I
you could buy a tent.
Maybe.
You could buy like
a small tent.
Or a tarp.
Yeah,
or a tarp.
The tarp is better.
Yeah, I mean,
so it kind of puts in perspective, the situation.
Yeah, I think
going on with home prices and whatnot.
I did see that in the news, and interesting story, and he's gonna, when you are at the top, you take a lot of heat from everybody. So these types of things don't go unnoticed. And going back to some of the structural issues that you and I have talked about over the last couple of years, and especially in real estate, there's a lot of work to be done about getting people affordable housing, creating more inventory, right? You talked about that before. We need more inventory. We need more affordable housing. Right. We need to get more homes built. I think probably that's another takeaway from this, that there's work to be done to get other people into homes and whatnot, and we've got some work to do there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. I really enjoy your pieces, and your colleagues' pieces, and keep it coming. And look forward to having you back on the program next week. Take care. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the long weekend. And
you too.
I'm going to think about President Lincoln and President Washington. Good men. Take care,
All
Jared.
right.
Take care, bud.
Bye.
Bye. Welcome back. We're going to talk a little retirement now. And joining me on the line, she is the retirement reporter for Dow Jones Market Watch, Miss Alessandra Melito. Hi, Allie. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing quite well on this Friday afternoon, going into a long President's Day weekend for some. What's going on in your world? What's going on for the folks at Market Watch when it comes to retirement?
Yeah, so this week the White House unveiled its proposal for the budget for fiscal year 2021, and it got some headlines because part of it included cuts to Medicare and Social Security, disability, and Medicaid, and a few other things, of course. And so I looked into it, and I spoke to a few of the budget experts who said that while the numbers do show that there are cuts to these programs, and obviously that always elicits anger from people, as those are their programs. It's actually not going to be. It wouldn't be as bad as people think. So, like benefits, for example, would not be cut. Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, these are huge programs that there are a lot of moving parts to it, and it's not all about benefits. So the budget wouldn't cut participants' benefits. There are other ways that they would be trimming the program. So one way for like Medicare, for example, is like just the way that the program is run. It could be administrative costs that Medicare, that the budget proposes cutting. So administrative stuff. For Social Security, it is disability, like changing the rules for how people can claim disability and like tightening restrictions and eligibility requirements and things like that. Medicaid, that would possibly affect benefits just because of like they do want to do a few things there. But like a lot of people were worried that Medicare, if they'd make cuts to Medicare, people would get less access to healthcare, or like not as many people would get healthcare access, and that's not exactly the case. That being said, just because Social Security benefits aren't being cut and Medicare benefits aren't being cut doesn't mean that there aren't impacts to retirees. So, for example, under Medicare, one of the provisions that the budget proposes is that there's something to do about like paying the healthcare providers. So if that were to happen, then some healthcare providers might not be interested in participating in Medicare anymore. And if that happens, then obviously retirees do not have they might have less of a selection. If their doctor says that they don't want to participate, then they have to move on and find another doctor. So that's one thing. And there are a few other provisions that weren't like top of mind in the budget. You had to look a little more carefully, but things that had to do with like how you qualify for care at a skilled nursing facility. Right now it's like 3 consecutive days that you have to be an inpatient. You have to be an inpatient at the hospital, and they suggested like expanding that I think to like 8 days before you become qualified to move on to a skilled nursing facility. So things like that. And then there are things that aren't mentioned in the main budget at all, but if you look at the supporting documents for the budget, you'll see. So like there are programs for older Americans that they are suggesting get cut through larger, like eliminating larger programs. So one is called, I've got to find the name of it. It's the low-income home energy assistance program, which is something that low-income families and many older Americans rely on for helping them get their energy bills paid, and that means keeping their homes warm during the colder months or getting air conditioner during the hotter months, because obviously, when the temps drop, like today, I think, or tomorrow, it's supposed to be, like 10 degrees?
Yeah.
Your home gets cold really fast. And,
yep.
That could be a real problem. You could, get sick or worse. So that's one thing. And then there's, so through the elimination of some federal block grants, that they would also see less support maybe for Meals on Wheels. And Senior Community Service Employment Program, which is a program that helps assist low-income and unemployed Americans find like part-time jobs at nonprofits, things like that. Let's see, I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, and then lastly, another suggestion the budget had was trimming or changing some rules for SNAP, which is, food stamps. And a lot of older Americans also rely on that. So if they would kind of restrict eligibility unless you had certain, like, you had to do like more hours of work, I think. They're changing the way that you can receive benefits. So all those little details are how it can impact older Americans in negative ways. But it's not necessarily like, because you hear somebody say like, oh, I'm going to cut X billion dollars from Medicare, and you think, oh my God, like now I'm not going to get health care.
Right.
But that's not necessarily true. It's the little things you have to look for.
Yeah, and some of it, obviously, the rhetoric can be scare tactics. And I think it's important to point out, Allie, the president comes up with a budget, and then it goes to the Congress. Congress has the purse strings, right? And these are the types of things where there's negotiation. So typically in a budget, there's negotiation between the House and the executive branch, and they kind of work things out. So just because the president outlines it in his budget, it's not like he's the king or she's the king.
Yeah, and
they make these things go through the machination process, and a lot of backroom dealing and conversations that are supposed to be had.
Yeah, and also this is not the first time that these types of cuts have been suggested. I mean, they were suggested last year, they were suggested the year before. Medicare and Social Security and those types of programs are always mentioned when it comes to budget cuts. But what is interesting this year is, although Congress will definitely not pass this, it's also an election year, which means that people in Congress, the politicians who want to be in Congress, all these different people, they're going to be very sensitive to those types of programs because people take them very seriously. A lot of Americans rely on these programs, so you don't want to hear the word cut. Even if it's like administrative or not, you don't want to hear that as a voter. So people who are looking to be reelected or be elected are going to be very sensitive to how they treat these entitlement programs.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, and that's something I was going to say to you, is that it is an election season, and so people need to run campaign ads, and what better way to run a campaign ad than to have yourself coming out against or for a particular issue and try to persuade voters to support your side over the other side. And I guess more to come on this. We'll have more conversations, and hopefully we don't get down to the end of the year, Allie, and I'm talking about like December, and we don't have the same rigmarole that we had at the end of last year, where we don't have a budget, we don't get through all these things, and then it's a big kerfluffle and big issue, and that they're passing bills that we can't even read or hear about at the last minute.
I am very interested to see what the end of the year brings.
I think there's a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people in that, and I think there's a lot that's going to be happening. Allie, always a pleasure chatting with you and reading your work, and look forward to enjoy the weekend, of course, and look forward to having you on again next week.
Great. All right. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome back, and now we're going to shift gears, talk a little bit about retirement legislation, regulation, and who better to do that than the Legal Eagles, David Levine, Kevin Walsh. Both are principals with the Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you?
We're doing well, Jeff. It's dreary here in D.C., but I think we've got a record streak going of having two Eagles on the program.
I know you guys are amazingly busy, and I know the audience and I appreciate you guys making time out of your busy schedule. So, David, let's come to you to kick things off. Secure Act. I know you guys have been looking deep into this and kind of weighing all the issues. What do you have to say?
Sure. I think this week, Jeff, what we're going to talk about is what are we looking for near-term guidance from the IRS. And some of this is for things in 2021, but people are starting to think ahead already to the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of, I'll call the macro thing, plan formation and new plan designs. And then Kevin's going to talk a little today about some of the changes that people have to deal with, put bluntly, now. And it would be great to get some IRS guidance, but recognizing they have limited bandwidth. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something we've talked many, many times about, of course, is open maps, pooled employer plans, whatever you want to call it. A lot of that is in the land of the Department of Labor. And ironically, a lot of this is kind of joint jurisdiction between the Department of Labor and IRS. So there's sort of a tag team there. But one area that really squarely falls within the IRS world, and has historically, is the issue of the one bad apple. Because this is where if someone joins a pooled employer plan, that means someone starts up a plan, joins a MEP, or someone joins a MEP. The question is, how do you fix it if their plan doesn't stay if their activities take the plan out of compliance? The IRS last year put out guidance that was designed to clean up the one bad apple, which has a multi-step process with notice and steps to basically try to tell people you need to get your act in order, or else we're going to kick you out of the plan, spin you off to a plan, and have that plan resolve the issue. That guidance was positive. There's a lot of comments on it. Is certainly, I think, for some perspectives, complex, and people are concerned there's too many steps. Others think it's designed to be protective. But now with Secure and Secure's focus on PEPs and sort of its own one bad apple language, one of the things to hope for is a harmonization. And it doesn't mean it's going to happen immediately, but the discussions are good to happen soon because the DOL certainly has to do things. And when you have multi-agency, it's good for them to be working forward early on guidance about, okay, how do we really fix a one bad apple? Also, how does it work? Because if someone makes a mistake in a new pooled employer plan, how is the best way to resolve it? What if it's in an old-fashioned, I'll call traditional MEP that is not subject to the pooled employer plan rules? Are we going to have separate rules for one bad apple? The hope is that the service will start bringing these together in harmonization soon in reaction to testimony and just Secure. So that's the first thing. More to come. But if you're thinking of joining a PEP or you're thinking of creating one, this is something to keep in mind. And if you have an open MEP, definitely keep it in mind. But it's something that I think a lot of people are interested in. The second item I'm going to touch before tossing over to Kevin today is the small employer startup credit. There are new credits. There's expansion of existing credits, new credits that allow additional credits for people creating a plan. The question that comes to mind is with new designs, people may move around. There's two ways that this could all go. Number one, someone could join a MEP or a PEP, and bring their existing plan in, or create a brand new participation in that MEP or PEP, or they could also at some point come out of one of these plans. And the question is, when can you get this big startup credit for your employees? Is it something that if you start a plan and you join a MEP or PEP, you could take it again? Probably not, but who knows? But what if you are an employer that's never had a plan and you join an existing MEP or PEP? And this is relevant today. What if you join a PEO, for instance? Should you be able to get a credit? It seems logical if we're trying to encourage people to save to actually say the credit applies the first time you ever go into a plan, not necessarily if it's one that you just create. But we're going to wait to see that. So those are two big things, because as people are pushing forward on creating new plans, it makes a big difference today for an employer that's thinking of starting a plan. But Kevin, I know there's a lot of sort of operational, like real practical items. You want to talk about a couple other things?
So there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about with required minimum distributions, and I don't think we're going to talk about all of them today. But just at a high level, there's kind of three areas, and one is just so big that we're not going to talk too much about it today. And then I'm going to just highlight some of the issues, the other two, where RMDs have become a hot topic. And RMDs are those required minimum distributions that people need to take from IRAs, essentially so the government can eventually get revenue on money that's been saved for retirement. The first change that we've seen, and it's gotten all the attention, and it's the one that I'm not going to focus much on, is the post-death required minimum distribution rules for IRAs and defined contribution plans. And here, the idea was that you used to be able to take your required minimum distributions over the lifetime of the designated beneficiary. The Secure Act changed that, so it's now a 10-year window in most cases. And there's a number of areas where we could probably do a whole episode on coming up with scenarios and figuring out how those rules would work for that. And I think there's some hope that Treasury will kind of, I don't know, if they can't provide guidance, they could at least provide a couple of examples of how the rules apply to different fact patterns, like certain trusts. A second real area where the RMD rules have changed and where we desperately need guidance is kind of the increased age for required minimum distribution. So under Secure, kind of at the beginning of 2020, the age at which required minimum distributions begin moves from 70.5 to 72 for individuals who turned 70.5 after December 31st, 2019. And that sounds like it's very easy to administer. Like, oh my gosh, it's just we add a year and a half. But it causes a whole bunch of transition problems. So the first is that, if you're telling people they've got to take the required minimum distributions, a lot of those trains left the station in December. So there are these notices that went out telling folks, you're turning 70.5, you've got to take your required minimum distribution. So that's one area we've actually gotten some guidance. IRS put out notice 2020-6 that said, if you've sent out a notice telling somebody they've got to take a required minimum distribution this year, and it turns out due to the change in the Secure Act they don't have to, well, get them an updated form by April 15th. Now, the area where guidance would be great, but that it's kind of a bigger stretch how you get there, is suppose you're one of those folks who was told, I need to take an RMD. And suppose you say, okay, and you took your money out. Now, how do you get your money back in the plan? So you might want to say, well, I only took the money out because I was told I had to take an RMD. If I don't have to take it, I would rather have the money there. And I think there's some hope that Treasury could issue some guidance to facilitate the ability of people to either put the money back into a plan or put it into an IRA and avoid some of the tax consequences of taking a distribution at a time when the individual really thought they had to, but in fact, they don't need to. The next big area with RMDs, and kind of the last one that I'm talking about today, and it's not actually RMDs, it's kind of just regular distributions, is with birth and adoption distributions. And, this provision, I didn't think was a big deal when the Secure Act came out because it allows individuals to take a penalty-free withdrawal of up to $5,000, for a 1-year period when they've had a birth or adoption of a child. And I thought this was pretty straightforward. And then we kind of looked at it more closely and, a whole host of issues come up and, we can look at it as a provision that could operate similarly to how we've allowed distributions penalty-free when there's been kind of a natural disaster. And I know having a child is very different than a natural disaster, but it's one of the few other cases where we allow people to take money out penalty-free before they get to retirement.
Kevin, your editorialization about children. I'm sorry. The next session is going to be a sensitivity and inclusiveness discussion for all of us.
Did we just lose all of our child listeners?
Well, that would include me with my own child. So yes.
all of our children who are listening have just stopped listening. But so things like substantiation, what requirements are there going to be? Will it be just a certification for the individual that they've had a birth or adopted a child? Or will there be some more paperwork required? Do you have to allow the individual who takes the distribution to pay it back? If so, is there kind of a time period for paying it back? How does if you have multiple children or adopt multiple children at a time, does that mean you can kind of stack these and instead of taking 5,000, you can take 10,000 out? There's a whole host of kind of administrative things around this seemingly straightforward provision that. It would be great to get some IRS guidance. Now, David, I know that you were. I thought I was taking the pro-child side here, so I'll let you go from here, and you can argue against children.
Kevin, thanks for the setup. You know what? I love children, especially my own. So therefore, I'm not going to say anything more at this point. We've taken enough of Jeff's time for today. I'm going to say we'll wait to see what we get on the guidance about how they interpret this, about repayments and everything like that as we go forward. Yeah. And Jeff, next week we'll have something funny to talk about after Kevin and I go through our mandated Eagles therapy.
Well, I got news for you. Number one, in all seriousness, great segment for those people out there listening in our RMD age. And for employers who are thinking about this, I agree, and I'm really excited that you brought these things up. And then secondly, I'll just say that I don't think either of you are bad apples, regardless of what Kevin just said about children. Just kidding, Kev. But thank you so much for appearing, and enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll talk to you all very, very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Well, that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday podcast, and I want to thank all of our contributors who do a fabulous job analyzing all the news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and more. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us as well. We certainly hope you were informed and, of course, entertained. Just quick note that we will not be on the air tomorrow. It is President's Day, so we're taking a little bit of a breather, just like many of you out there. But we'll be back Tuesday morning with Dan Klein of The Motley Fool looking at tech. So until next week, I'm Jeff Snyder. Keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.